All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the South Orange Library Winter Lecture Series. It was fall last month, and now we have to just accept the fact that it's winter. This is now the Winter Lecture Series Special Conversations. I'm Laura Sims, the moderator, and I'm so pleased to have Alex Torpey with us today. He's a favorite of the program. He's been coming since 2016 and giving talks. This is the first time when I'm hosting though, so I'm very excited. And for most of you probably know, but Alex is the former village president of South Orange. Since then, he's worked as a municipal business administrator, a consultant for places like Sustainable NJ, a professor at Seton Hall, and he founded a digital consulting company, among many other achievements. He's also an avid hiker, a camper, and an avid science fiction reader and writer, which is something we might talk about later, because I love science fiction. And in general, he enjoys being in and finding ways to protect our planet. He took a 4-month road trip across the country this past summer, and now he's back in New Jersey. We're glad to have him back. So welcome to the program, Alex.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And since I mentioned that trip, and I know that you came on earlier in the year and talked when you were kind of in the middle of the trip, right? Mm-hmm. But I'd love, now that you're back and you have perspective and it's over, I'd love to just hear about your thoughts and what you've learned from the trip.
Yeah, it's a lot. I appreciate that. I mean, yeah, the last time I chatted with everybody here, it was in the back of my pickup truck in Montana.
Wow.
And so somehow managed to find some cell phone service out there and do that. Wow. A little easier in Sussex County, New Jersey, though not that much, unfortunately. So that was one thing I certainly learned, is there's still a lot of the country that doesn't have high-speed internet and doesn't have cell phone service, which is a pretty big problem, especially think about everybody last year, town government, so many things moving online.
Right.
So that was sort of surprising how wide some of those gaps were, but it was really cool. I mean, I got to meet a lot of people in different states, visited a couple cities, spent a lot of time camping out in like national forest land where you can kind of just go wherever you want to. And it was, I mean, the North American continent is just, I mean, it's hard to put it into words.
Yeah.
It was really incredible.
That's awesome. And why did you just want to do this at some point and this was a good time to do it?
Yeah, basically. I mean, I had been interested in doing something like that for years, and I'm interested in doing it again. Also, yeah. I spent so much time sort of off the grid on this trip, disconnected, starting to write some of that science fiction book that we've talked about. But I want to spend more time. I spent a little bit of time chatting with people about things that were happening kind of in their, slice of the world. But I'd like to spend more time doing that and going into communities. And, that's part of what I've enjoyed doing with my work too, is just kind of learning what's out there. So last year, I had a lease end, the semester ended, a consulting contract ended, all around the same time, around April or May. And I said, I'm interested in buying in New Jersey a house. Real estate market, not amazing for buyers. Still not amazing. And so I said, why not? Let's hit the road for a few months and, get out of the house and see what's out there.
That's great. And you went in your pickup truck?
Yep. And wow. Slept in the truck or in a hammock or in a tent, kind of depending on how worried I was about grizzly bears in any particular place.
Wow, that's amazing. That's great. Yeah, so I know we're supposed to talk about improving public engagement in civic life. So I would love it if you could start us off just with some of your thoughts on that topic. Very important topic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think, and there's an interesting role that I'll come around to in a moment about, I think, how libraries can plug into this too. I mean, so Laura, you mentioned, some of the things that I've worked on over the last few years, and I feel very lucky that I've had the opportunity to kind of work in a bunch of different places and meet a lot of different people. And, I've chatted with folks in, Baptist churches in Newark and in, national forest lands in Montana and on Native American reservations in North Dakota. And all over the country and in different countries all around the world. And whether it's like in a diner in Tennessee or a meeting in the White House or a bed and breakfast in Uganda, the conversations, been really lucky to get the chance to hear a lot of different perspectives. And of course, anybody who knows me knows that the following is true, that I love starting political conversations kind of wherever I go. And so getting people talking about those things, either intentionally or unintentionally. And I guess, what the reflection here is like, a lot of those times, so some of those times that I'm out in those places, I'm, going to St. Louis, Missouri to meet with like civic leaders in the city to talk about how they can use technology to improve how they engage people in the city to work on civic problems. And so sometimes there's something, it's more formal, sometimes it's more informal, but a lot of it is helping people think through the challenges that are in front of them, and bringing in some of these different perspectives, and kind of, giving that to them as much as I can. And, this is being a little generous to myself, but I almost think that it's almost like a traveling librarian to an extent, helping people access more than what they had access to. And the reason I like that label, and I'm not sure it's 100% accurate, but I like it because I think what is so cool about libraries and librarians, and I'm not just saying this because I'm here with the South Orange Public Library, which for those of you who don't know, this was my start kind of in getting involved in South Orange, like a month or two out of college, got appointed to the library board, and it was just such a cool experience. But I think what I learned from that and what I've learned since then is that I think what librarians understand really well is how to organize, is that how you organize and access something, in their case, maybe it's information or knowledge or resources, that how you organize and access that makes a huge difference in the experience the person has with that thing. I think they understand that like things are not just in some natural state, but that everything has a framework that we have applied to it. And those frameworks have a really huge impact on people's experiences, and that we should be really thoughtful and intentional about how things are organized so that we can curate or facilitate the right kind of experience. And I think we're seeing consequences of this not going well right now in a lot of parts of our country, in a lot of communities. I think that, let me think about how traditional or social media platforms are organized and how they organize information and the cultural dynamics that come from that. I think we're starting to really understand how massive of an influence how those things are organized have on how people think. And it's affecting, how we think about ourselves and how we think about the world around us. And that structuring these things more intentionally is really important. I think we sort of take that for granted. It's like, oh, social media works this way, and there's all these issues that come with it, and we just have to deal with those issues. It's like, no, we design those systems, either explicitly or implicitly. They have values built into them. And if we want that to work better, we could design better systems. And I think we can think about that with how the media works and how our political systems work and all sorts of things. Like we don't have to just deal with bad consequences downstream. We can redesign the things to work better. And so, our internet is showing us things that it thinks that we already want to know more about, right? Like pulling us down into rabbit holes, because the more that we engage on the platform, the more money they make through advertising. But we could design a platform that doesn't do that. We could have platforms that broaden our horizons instead of narrow them, or we could have platforms that temper how much we engage instead of taking advantage of that. So, I think that's sort of part of the context that brings me to kind of where I'm at, is that we have a lot to do there. And I think that like where I'm at right now, thinking through all of these things seems really important. And so that's part of what has brought me to some projects trying to figure out how we can plug libraries into rebuilding local civic infrastructure, because the problems that we see at the national level the sad thing is that it seems to be cascading down to the local level instead of the good stuff at local levels working their way up. And I think we need to address that like head on. So, I started a podcast talking about some of these things, exploring some of these partnerships with libraries. And then, a kind of cool, maybe sort of announcement type thing is, so I've been teaching at Seton Hall for a while, you mentioned, and Seton Hall has asked me to create a new undergraduate class tackling some of these issues for undergrad students about civics, polarization, social media, and how we're having conversations and what we can do better in the future. So all these things are sort of related, and it's a little context of kind of where my head is at right now.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing. I was just wondering, so you're talking about in terms of social media, you're talking about creating like an alternate platform. Do you feel any hope for Silicon Valley kind of participating in that kind of thing, or is this something that other people would kind of launch and do as an alternative?
It's a good question. I mean, I'd like to think that Silicon Valley would be interested. I think that more and more people, we've seen programmers and senior level people at Google and Facebook and places like that some of whom started nonprofits to sort of push back on some of the issues that their platforms have created or at least exacerbated. And so I'd like to think that that's possible. I mean, I think it just comes down to the business model. And if the platforms, Facebook has always made a big deal about, we promise we'll never charge you. Everything's free. Like, we're never going to close our doors to you. And it's like, well, sure, you're not going to close your doors because it's an advertising platform. So you want more people on it. But it's like they had decided that the free platform was better without any of us participating in that. And I don't know if you could pay $5 a month or $10 a month. And it's not just about removing the ads, right? It's like changing the whole platform. So now it doesn't try to pull you in anymore. It's not playing with the psychology that we know is what casinos use to keep people addicted to slot machines. Like, I mean, the people who design those have admitted that that's the exact science they use to design the newsfeed feature. And I would pay $10. I mean, I don't know if that's enough, but I think people would be willing to have that conversation. And I don't know if the tech companies are, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, it sounds good to me. I was wondering, what are you thinking about for your class for Seton Hall? Like, what's going to be on your syllabus?
Well,
have you thought that far?
A little bit. There's a couple ideas, and then I'm going to be trying to gather some feedback from people in my network and through LinkedIn in some places, and ask people what they think are some of the most pressing issues too. I want to sort of, it's not quite right to call it designing it open source, but I want to be very very collaborative with how things get incorporated into this. I think that talking about helping students understand, for example, the incentives of the platforms they use and the business models behind that, and having that sort of layer of context on those things would be really valuable. Same for newspapers and journalism, right? They're based on the same model that Facebook is based on. And the more ads they sell, the better they do. And does that change the way that they produce information and engage with us? And I think it does. I think tackling misinformation and disinformation is going to be really important. And that it's not like there's real news and fake news and there's just two buckets. I think that sort of dichotomy or binary dynamic is part of what leads us astray a little bit, and that it's more complicated than that. And, every single person who puts out anything is implementing a set of values on what they're putting out. And instead of pretending to be objective, like, we're a news channel and we're perfectly objective, just tell us what the biases are and let us, sort through that maybe. And so I think there'll be some exercises about that, like giving students information maybe about, let's say, a local ordinance that's being voted on. They have to write 250 words about it, but they have way more than that they've been given. What information do they choose to include or not include, and why? And comparing maybe different examples that people produce so that we can understand why people chose to include what information, what impact that has. How do we be aware of the biases that we have instead of pretending like they don't exist?
Right. And that is something that I know at least K to 12 school librarians, that's one of their big focuses is information literacy.
Right.
I think that's like the new generation of school librarians for the new, the younger kids. Like a lot of it is providing that context, helping them figure out what's good information, what's bad information. But this is good because it's for adults, basically.
Right.
And there needs to be more of that, I think.
Yeah, I think all age groups could benefit
Yes.
from engaging with this.
Definitely. You mentioned that you thought libraries could help with public engagement. What are you thinking? Do you have specific ideas for how that could work, and why libraries?
Libraries are such an interesting opportunity, I think, because I think they're one of the only public institutions that people don't think are politically biased. And that's really important right now is credibility. And I think that a lot of people, especially in politics, they are happy to, undermine the credibility of institutions, some of which are doing a terrible job at things, like no doubt, but that doesn't mean that the concept of the institution itself is wrong. Maybe it does, but those are two different things. And I feel like, especially in politics, people are happy to undercut anything out there as long as it benefits their next reelection or helps them raise money. And so, finding institutions that have credibility, not with one group, but cross-demographic, cross-partisan credibility. I joke that try to think of one person in the United States that, people on the left and people on the right would listen to. And the only thing I can come up with is maybe Dolly Parton. I think has, really wide. There's no, who can say anything bad about Dolly Parton?
Nope.
And so, but who's like that? We have so few institutions that have that credibility, and I think that libraries have some of that. And I think librarians are already plugging in this gap a little bit, right? And maybe, I don't know if you have any reflections on this too. It sounds like from librarians that I've talked to about this, that they're already, if someone comes into the library with a question about something, let's say it's a question about election results or a question about vaccines or something like that, it's up, and they have a question, and maybe that question is really loaded one way or the other. Now it's in the librarian's hands to respond to that and sort of say, well, how do you engage this person without turning them away? If they're coming from a place where it doesn't seem like they've done a lot of research, how do you get them to be more critical? How do you get them to look at other sources and come to their own opinion, not just follow what they read out there? And so I think librarians are already doing some of this, and it would seem interesting to formalize that a little bit and try to plug libraries in, especially in small towns that are struggling talking about really important issues.
Absolutely. And where the library is probably like the community center too in a lot of the towns, right? Definitely. Yeah, definitely, when I started actually working at a public library, which was only 2.5, 3 years ago here in town, I was definitely surprised at the kinds of questions that we get, and the things that people need from us were not what I expected from 2 years of library school. Definitely people come in with medical questions and all kinds of questions that they do seem to think like this is a trustworthy place to go for that information. So yeah, I think it's a really accurate reflection.
And how do we take advantage of that without undermining? I mean, obviously, the librarians and library directors I've talked to about some of these things, I think they seem to agree. Their community trusts them, especially in communities. It was a great example in one of the towns I worked in as a business administrator in Leonia in Bergen County. The town has a really large Korean American population in town. I think it was something like maybe 35% of the community, and there was not a lot of touch points between the municipal government and that community. But the library was heavily engaged with folks part of that community in town, and they were offering like Korean language first programming, celebrating events on a Korean calendar. I mean, it was like they were really plugged in And that was so cool to see that, like, it really was a home and a community space. And so I think especially for communities within communities that don't
Mhm.
have the same level of access, libraries are often already right there kind of on the front lines.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I know you had some more like formal ideas for how libraries could become involved. So if you want to share those.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, I think these are all pretty early in thinking.
yes.
But one of them, so, like you mentioned, there's a lot of, I think some public libraries also are teaching like media literacy classes. I've
Mhm.
started listening and reading, what's basically available I can find online. And there's some pretty interesting stuff out there, but I will say that a lot of it, um, is more conceptual, and some of it's not as day-to-day practical. Like,
Mm.
how do you go to a council meeting in your town? How do you engage with elected officials that way? If you're on a committee in a town, how do you use that position responsibly to advocate for an important issue?
Mhm.
If you are a person who lives in a town, which I think all of us are, and you see a conversation on Facebook getting out of control, what's the best way to jump in there and help? Is it adding your own opinion? Is it suggesting that people look at some other source? Like, what's really the practical day-to-day way to plug into some of these things? And so, what we've talked about a little bit is, classes like a civic engagement certificate class that we
Mhm.
would expect that elected officials in a town would take, to sort of like start and lead by example. And that it might be something where it might be a couple hour, maybe in one or two different, sessions, where you get people thinking, how do you disagree with your neighbor without hating them?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
that would be valuable. How do you go
Absolutely.
to, how do you listen to people in a council meeting?
Right.
How do you present information to someone who has a different perspective than you? Like there's some of these things like that, and try to get people maybe a little bit better, or thinking a little bit more about how to talk to each other, and especially helping the towns understand what their role in this is, which is that they shouldn't really be just pushing a political agenda of whoever's in charge, but they should really be trying to bring people into the process and think a little more long term about how to create like a constructive, healthy civic environment, which I think we used to have in a lot of communities in the
Mhm.
US, but we don't have the same membership in Rotary clubs and Lions clubs and organizations like that were involved. And so who's going to step in and play some of that role? So I think those classes could be interesting. I think libraries moderating discussions about important local issues could be really interesting. If there's a controversial thing coming up on an agenda for a council vote, instead of posting the agenda online, step one. Step two, people going crazy on Facebook about their own opinions about stuff. Step three, coming into the council meeting and making the same speech. Step four, the council members voting whatever they were going to do anyway, unless it's an election year, then voting the opposite of what they were going to do anyway. Like, couldn't we do those steps a little bit better? And couldn't there be one place that people could go in their community where they could actually talk about the issues with other people, and have
Mhm.
a facilitator or a moderator who isn't trying to push people in one direction, but is just trying to bring neighbors together to talk about important issues? And it seems like libraries could potentially be an interesting place for that. And the feedback I've gotten from people in a lot of these different places that I've been to and worked at is that people want the ability to have real conversations with people that have a different background and perspective than they do. They just don't have anywhere to go to do that. And everything sort of like fizzles out and gets really antagonistic when it's online.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I was thinking of, while you were talking, I was thinking about the turf, the battle over
Right.
turf in South
Right.
Orange Maplewood. I just had to, I mean, I try not to go on Soma Lounge too much anyway, but just that like, yeah, it explodes. It explodes. It's like, this is the outlet for this. It's not a discussion on social
Right.
media. There's no nuance on social media. So where do we go? Where else do we go to talk about these things?
Right. I mean, and people used to go to Maplewood Online, which was a horrible place. It was, I mean, it's, when I think back to, I've like some of the things that people used to say and get away with, and I mean, it was totally outrageous and totally counterproductive to anything constructive. And, we gained a lot in South Orange by pushing back on that and really at a certain point ignoring what was happening there and creating, 20 different ways that people could get involved. And actually, I'm pretty sure I remember a board of trustees meeting where I held up a list. I was like, and it was just after, I won't even say what the comment was. It was so horrible of what someone said on Maple Online about somebody else. And I said, I don't want this sort of negativity in my life. And I don't want to be exposed to this. I don't want to interact with this. I'm done with this platform completely. But there's office hours and there's committees and there's surveys that we sent out. And there was 20 different things of ways that you could get involved and send feedback in ways that were more constructive than that. And, it improved our decision-making once I think the other elected officials realized that it was actually a really small number of people that typically are really active on these platforms, and that the small number of people aren't representative of the broader community. People would come to me and say, did you see what's happening on Maple Online? Oh my God, there's a million people upset about this. And then here I am on the rescue squad, talking to people every day, down at Starbucks, sitting at my computer where people, every 15 minutes, people were interrupting me with, oh, I've got a question about this thing on the agenda. And I would take off my headphones and we'd chat for a few minutes. And then I go back to work or working on schoolwork or whatever. And I'm like, not a single person in any of these places has even brought this up. I don't think it's actually an issue. And there was just such a mismatch, but it's so easy to see that stuff online. I think it's easy for it to appear larger than it is. And by giving it credit, we sort of give it it only has power because people give it power, but people have to go somewhere to talk about stuff. And one of the towns that I worked in, after I left, there was a post that the mayor made on Facebook that was very controversial, and people were really, there was dozens of negative comments and people frustrated about something, and the reaction from the town was to turn off comments and stop posting on Facebook. And it's okay, but that doesn't solve the problem. Right. People need this is during COVID, people can't even meet in person when this happened. You got to give people an avenue to engage and get involved. And what is it?
Right. I guess my question is, so let's say libraries start hosting these discussion forums with moderators for groups. What's the connection between the library and then the local government? How does that translate and help with change of process?
I think that's a great question too. My initial sense of it is that having a little autonomy would probably be better. That this is not a process you necessarily want elected officials to be directly managing. If you could separate it out a little, I think the value, especially let's say with the value of good journalism, is that it's sort of independent, or it's supposed to be independent. And, I think the library, it's tough because depending on the town and how their library board is formed and financed and appointed, in South Orange, the village president appointed library board members. And so is the library going to push back on, there's definitely a balance there. But I think that from the perspective of people coming to the meetings, my sense would be that the more independent it is, the better. And that maybe the library writes up notes and says, okay, we had 31 people come to the meeting about the turf field. And, there were 21 questions about environmental things. There was 8 questions about health things. And there was 4 questions about cost. And here's what we talked about. And here were the opinions that were shared. And here's how it progressed. And it's not easy to do that, I think. Without putting a spin on it by mistake. Right. But I think it could be done. And then you share that with the governing body, share that with the community at large, and say, here's what people talked about, and here were their questions. And, that would be, would that solve these problems? I don't know if this one step would do it, but it would seem to move us in the right direction, at least. And that seems worth trying. Right.
And it wouldn't necessarily kind of come back on the library and poison it with lack of neutrality if you use that model, keep it independent, right?
Yeah, I think that would be valuable. And there's other, there's ideas out there, community information districts. is one where basically, we have different taxing districts. So like some towns have a separate taxing district for like a fire department. And although I'm not sure that makes total, we have too many local government entities in New Jersey, but there's a legal mechanism or a business improvement district. We have ways to create layers, right? And then assess people within those layers. And what if you did that and charged every house, I don't know, 25 cents, and that money, or $1 or something a year, and that went into a fund, and that fund went into support local journalism. And could that be a way to create funding for local journalism that isn't reliant upon advertising? I just had a call earlier this morning with some folks who work in the cryptocurrency world, and they're really interested in finding ways to use things like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency to help support this, to help support more decentralized, expert-driven reporting on issues. Like, do you have to hire one reporter to report on a bunch of different issues? Or if there happens to be a water quality expert who lives in town, could they be freelance contracted to write a really in-depth, piece about the water quality issues? But they're not going to write about the school issues because that's not their expertise. So I think there's different models here.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you think about like how specifically to get young people involved in public discourse, and have you thought about that as well?
That's been a big part of what I've been trying to work on for the last 10 years. Being a young person elected myself, I mean, I think there was a lot of roadblocks to that. I mean, I remember people laughing at me when I knocked on doors, and they were like, "You're running for what? Like, how old are you?" And it's like, okay, I get that, but also, are you happy with how things are going? And the answer is no. And so I think that there are I've worked with a couple different organizations over the years that trying to get young people to run for office, and designed a program called Pathways for America in 2017, I think, where we were recruiting people. It was a nationwide nonpartisan program. We're recruiting people to try to get them not just to run for office, but basically to do more, to plug more in whatever passion, whatever like civic passion they had, and we would help them discover that. And we discovered a lot of roadblocks. And so like one of them that comes up a lot is, especially with running for office specifically, because I think that young people want to get involved in these things. They just don't know where to plug in. They see the negative kind of banter on, maybe online, God forbid, or like, somewhere else, or on social media. And they're like, what sane person would want to get involved in that and be the potential target of those things? Which, was an experience. There was some, a couple, I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 really mean people in South Orange who were, pretty, they were really harassing me, is just the simple way to put it. And, how do you get people to want to enter that space? I think that's difficult. And I also think that the way that young people see politics is that they see it, and it's often been a career. And most of these people don't want it. They don't want to do this for a career. And so one of the ways that we've tried to talk about running for office is not as a career model where longevity equals power, but as a service model. And that you see young people teach for America, the Peace Corps, the military, armed forces. There are plenty of places that young people will go. And running for office is not dissimilar from those in a couple different ways. One is that you don't make a lot of money or any money while you're doing it, which is a challenge in and of itself, especially for people who don't have the means to support themselves through that. But you're not going to make a lot of money in the experience. And it's going to be really difficult or stressful, or in some of those cases dangerous. But you're going to get to do two really cool things. One is have an actual positive impact on the community that you're serving while you're doing it, very tangible things that you can do. And two is that you're going to learn skills that will make you really great at other things in the future. Like it's a great training ground. And so helping young people think about it is, you don't have to go in there, run for town council, then run for mayor, then run for state legislator, then run for Congress. Like, you don't have to do it that way. You could go in for 2 or 3 or 4 for one term and then hop out. And that you can accomplish a lot in that one term period of time. And in fact, being a one-term elected official, you know, in the US, someone who gets elected to office and doesn't care about a re-election is a very potentially powerful person.
Right.
Because those short-term political incentives and biases, you know, it's what made me feel comfortable, like pushing back, let's say on Maplewood Online, is I wasn't worried if people were gonna, if I was wrong and everybody got really mad at me, and I was okay taking the heat for a little bit because the short-term stuff didn't really matter. And of course, you know, 6 months later or a year later, it turned out that I think we were all very happy to move on from it. But being able to sort of like be the tip of the spear there, it's really hard to do if you're running a re-election that year. But if you're only interested in doing it for one term and that's not part of your goals, like having to get everybody like you and make the donors happy and make the lobbyists happy, if you can just do what you think is right and think about the future, that's a really big difference. And I think that is more compelling to young people than the idea of like running for Congress and then you're basically spend 50% of your life fundraising.
Right.
And like, that sounds terrible.
Right. And that's the model that you followed too. Did you intend to do it that way, or do you ever think about getting back into politics? Or
yeah, it was a sort of half and half. You know, I knew that there were benefits to not running for a second term. I wasn't interested in doing that. You know, the scenario in my mind was that if I won the lottery or something like that, so that I wouldn't have to work outside of being in office, that I would consider doing a second term, because then I could just put all of my focus on it. But splitting the time between all those different things was so difficult and exhausting and draining. Like a 4-year commitment was already tough, like for a millennial to make to anything. Thinking about like 8 years, I couldn't even imagine that.
Right. Oh my gosh. And do you ever think about getting back into politics, or are you happy with like taking what you learned and applying it in all these different other areas now?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, I am happy kind of like helping other people run for office, and teaching people so they can come into like, you know, governments and be, you know, more innovative public administrators, or be, you know, feel more confident about being critical about some of the systems around us. I really like all of that. I do also think that it's possible that I would jump in again at some point too. I mean, I like that not being part of my life, because that is a very stressful thing to do. But also, you know, one of the benefits of being in elected office is you kind of get an automatic soapbox. And it's nice if there are things you want to advocate for. So like a big one for me is like shared services in New Jersey, and we tried to do a little bit of that. And I know that, you know, I mean, when I came in 2011, we were talking about sharing the fire departments between the two towns. And 10 years later, as I understand it, it's moving forward. And the conversations had started before me. So like these things take a really long time, but it's really important, because that's part of the reason why our property taxes are so high in New Jersey is like, you know, you could be in a 1 or 2 square mile town, and, you know, you could have a municipal government, the school district, the water authority, the sewer authority, the fire district. I mean, you can have like a million different governments all overlapping, and all those governments have their own attorneys and engineers and risk managers and financial planners. And it's like crazy how much money we spend on all of that. And so I'm trying to work on that from my position, you know, kind of outside of things. But would that be easier to do from an elected position? You know, it might be. So those are part of the things that I think about.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I thought I would pause right now, because we have about 20 minutes, and see if anyone wants to hop in with questions for Alex. Anyone? I'm going to ask about science fiction if nobody speaks up. You can unmute yourself. If you have a question, you're going to have to, I guess, Michael, would you mind unmuting people now? Just in case.
Yeah, I just did.
Oh, thank you. So if anybody has a question, you can speak up. Oops. It looks on my screen, it looks like everybody's still muted.
That's what I see.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask my science fiction question while this gets worked out. So I know that you read and write science fiction, and I love science fiction too. But I think it's so interesting. How do you see it as like part of your other interests and concerns for the world? Or do you see it as this separate, like, creative thing that you do?
Well, it's pretty new for me, and it's interesting because I think, as a consumer of science fiction content, some of the best works out there, I think, are, it's not dissimilar from looking at, like, studying animal behavior, where you're like, oh, this thing is really familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And that gives you, I think, can give you a really interesting perspective. So, like, good science fiction to me, it pulls you out of, your preconceptions, your assumptions, the mindsets that you're in, but it gives you a scenario that is directly relevant to what's happening. And so, like, one that comes up in a lot of science fiction works is, distinctions between your civilian sides of government, your law enforcement side of government, and your military. And, if you're in one little spaceship, let's say, in space, that might all be the same person. And what problems arise from that, and what boundaries are there, or should there be? And so, I love how those topics get explored. So the science fiction that I'm writing is, I think, what people would call hard sci-fi or realism. There's no magic or, like, elves or anything like that. It's not like a Lord of the Rings type thing or like a fantasy type thing. It's really meant to be an exploration of where one idea of where we might be going, exploring climate issues, technology, media consumption, surveillance, and government, and individual creativity and liberty, which, I think that is one of the most important things. It's one of the things that makes us human. Is the sort of ability, how we each contribute to the world around us. And, a lot of these dystopian stories, like, they are worlds that prioritize, like, safety and efficiency over individuality. And, like, that sounds kind of dangerous. And are there ways to balance that? And exploring all these concepts is just really fun.
Yeah, definitely. Are there writers that you kind of have been inspired by, or whose work you really love?
Yeah, definitely some of the classics. I mean, the George Orwells and Aldous Huxley. Just brilliant. And frightening, because some of these things are just oddly familiar. Probably one of my favorite, I got turned on to Octavia Butler recently by a friend, and her work is really amazing. Neil Stephenson is probably my favorite right now. So yeah, there's a handful out there that are, and I just started reading Dune, which is long overdue.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So
in time for the movie.
Well, so I watched the movie, which was good, but I also realized that the movie would be so much better if I, knew the book. And so I think there's going to be a few more movies. So I'm reading the book, which goes into a lot of detail about stuff that you could tell from the movie that, they just didn't have time to go into. And so I think it'll be fun to then watch the movie again after having read the book.
Oh, yeah. Cool. That'll be really good.
Like a sandwich. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just thinking about what you were saying about science fiction, just knowing from Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, whenever people ask her, oh, it's this dystopian novel, but she always said, everything in that novel has happened on this planet already. This is not some, crazy vision. This is actually happening in our world. Yeah, that's the great thing, or scary and really, like, eye-opening thing about science fiction, I think.
Yeah, same. And I'd like to think that we can use like, part of I think what's really difficult right now, kind of in this country is that we're really, a lot of us feel very defensive about our ideologies and perspectives, and figuring out a way, if you're going to just like face to face debate somebody about some topic, it's going to be really hard for anybody to move an inch on that. And so I think that, it is possible that, good art, good writing can maybe be a vehicle for allowing us to sort of step outside, and we can explore things without having to like defend our own identities and honors about them, that we can just throw things out there, and sort of like explore a little bit. And that's to me that's been part of the value of the advancements we've made throughout history, and part of the innovation of throughout the history of this country is like, we're not sure what the answer is, but like, let's experiment a little bit and try some different things and figure some things out. We've got some new ideas, we're going to try these out, let's see how they go, we're going to create a framework so that we can do better. And if we could find ways to allow ourselves to do that, where we can be a little more open-minded with how we approach new ideas, if science fiction could be a real vehicle for that, not just like, oh, this is a great book, let me put it on my bookshelf and not think about it again. But if it can tie into, if there's a way to tie it into the urgent and relevant conversations that we're having, is there a way to do that? Basically?
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great idea. And I know, some books have had this incredible influence.
Right.
But I don't know what the connection is between having that influence and actually enacting change in the world. It's hard to know.
It is. Yeah. And we don't know how these things, people will respond to these things in years.
Right. I mean, with all the divisiveness in our country right now, where do you see us in like 5 do you think we're heading for a civil war?
I don't think we're not heading. I don't.
You don't think we're not heading?
It feels it feels alarmist to think that, but also because I think that people have said things like that, throughout history, but also sometimes people were right. And right. Like, so it doesn't feel, and that's, I guess, part of, it's a very mixed, like cynicism and optimism or something of, especially from seeing people in all these different places, is just, there's a lot more that we have in common than it feels like. And, one of the examples that came up over the last year was, just thinking about, I think that we're doing not an amazing job in most cities with how we do redevelopment. We're moving too quickly, we're building too many things, we're not really taking into account the long-term needs of the community. We're sort of letting developers make a buck. And it helps the town make money too, because you get money from the taxes for that, and that helps your budget. People think that like, oh, only companies have a profit motive. Like, nonprofits and governments have profit motives too. They're just called different things. And they work slightly differently, but elected officials like running on low tax increases. That's their, quote unquote profit motive. And, so we just do this crazy development. And, if you go up and down, like, Hudson, Bergen County along New York City, I mean, the number of apartments that are being built, I mean, it is crazy. It's staggering. And it doesn't feel like there's a coordinated plan there, because it's happening in different municipalities that are not necessarily working together. And we're not looking at affordable housing on a regional or statewide level. So I think that, like, we're moving forward with some of those things in ways that are not really aligned with our own goals. And in, or let's say around New York City, or let's say Brooklyn, you might have activists who are maybe a little left of center, let's say, worried about gentrification of neighborhoods as new apartments get built and kicking people out who live there for a long time. But if you go out to, Bozeman, Montana, and you talk to people who've lived there for a while, you'll find people more right of center who are concerned about the very same things happening in their community. And, and that people are concerned in the East Coast and in the Midwest and in the Southwest and in the South. I mean, everybody's concerned everywhere about overdevelopment and basically taking communities that maybe need some support for sure, and some revitalization or some economic opportunity or some resources to reduce crime. Like we need to do something to help out folks who maybe are living in some of these parts of these cities, but just putting like a cookie cutter mall on top of that, is that the best solution? And that's happening everywhere. And people on the left and people on the right, I think we can all get on board with, whoa, okay, how do we infuse money into these communities without destroying and paving over the cultures that were already there? There must be a way for us to do that. And I do think that there are connection points on a lot of these issues, but politics and politicians, and even, I hate to say, mainstream media outlets and social media platforms, that all have the incentive to create more divisiveness and conflict. It is literally how their business models function. And so I think that we are led to believe that things are worse than they are, but it becomes true if we believe it. And so that's why I feel mixed about where we're going, because on one hand, I can see these common threads, and I can see that people are frustrated with government institutions that they don't think are treating them fairly, or politicians who don't represent their interests, or taxes that aren't being spent transparently, or communities that aren't being developed, in alignment with the values in the communities. Like all of these things, we can all agree on a lot of these things. We can agree on safety and health metrics that I think that, that we want to be safe. Like there are goals that we have in common, but then we get divided on how to do it. And like, I don't know. I mean, I certainly know a lot of my friends, and we've joked for years about, like, I think a lot of people think this, we think back to like the movie Independence Day or something like that. And it's like, if only we had an alien invasion and everybody got together. And then we all, right? Yeah. And then we were one unified front. And, but we had an emergency and we didn't do that. We got more divided. And so I worry, but I think it's somewhat like, if we believe there's division, we will keep sowing division. And if we could just focus on the other things for a minute, maybe we could regain some of the ground that we've lost. I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think we need stakeholders who aren't career-driven politicians or advertising-driven media platforms. We need some institutional stakeholders whose motivation is creating convergent narratives, not divergent narratives. And that has to be part of the solution.
Right. And that's where librarians come into this.
Yes.
Oh gosh, thank you, Alex. I'm going to ask real quick, anybody have a question? I don't know if the mute is off. I can't see it off, but okay. Well, I have a last question if nobody else does. So what are you doing now, and what's next for you?
So I'm working on a couple of these projects right now. And I'm basically working a couple days a week at a Y camp in Sussex County, which is amazing. I do environmental and outdoor education. So we teach kids about how the environment works. We do team building exercises with kids and adults too, and take kids on hikes and talk about how all of this works around us, and help them build their confidence to be the best versions of themselves. And it's funny because like working with kids this way is really rewarding, but it's also, I like to joke that when I was working in local government full-time, I was also working with kids every day. And so these are
just not as cute. Not as cute.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly true.
Not the feeling.
These are better types of kids. And it's actually really amazing because they are so curious about the world around them. And for the most part, not entirely all the time, but for the most part, most of the kids are really supportive of each other. And if they're trying to do a team exercise and someone is having trouble, like they'll help each other out. And I just compare that with some of the like cutthroat culture in some of the places that I've worked where you have adults undermining other adults intentionally so that they can gain or be more favorable looking to their bosses. And so like here are kids that we have the opportunity to sort of like help impart, you know, help keep them on the right track of supporting each other and not being insecure about themselves, being secure with themselves and helping other people. So that's been really interesting, and it's fun to get to spend more time outside, and it gives me the time to work on, you know, designing this new class, working on some of these other projects, doing some of the consulting. So that's a really nice balance, and it was a perfect way to come back from 4 months on the road.
Oh, I bet.
So that was
like a nice gradual transition back.
Yes, yes, exactly. Not completely living in the middle of the woods anymore, but still,
right. But
you know,
still
this part of New Jersey is, yeah, it's close.
That's really good. And are you still consulting for Sustainable NJ, or?
So we were working on a project called Public Information Engagement program that was a 1 year long. They had funding for 1 year on that. We are looking at, I have a few different entities, a few towns and other organizations that are interested in trying to get together and get some more funding to do more of that kind of work. So that's sort of the main thing on my, other than the class at Seton Hall, the main thing is, can we put some of these people together, including maybe organizations like Sustainable Jersey, organizations like the New Jersey Municipal Managers Association that I've been doing some work with on these same topics, like helping administrators engage with some of this content. How do you build trust in your community more? How do you use technology to do more public engagement? And so I'm trying to put a few stakeholders together and see if we can't get some funding to try and pilot some of these programs in a few different towns with a few different libraries, maybe with some university partnerships. So
that's great.
Yeah, it could be really cool if we could make something happen here. There's a need for it. Everybody's aware of the need. And it's like, do we want to try, you know, can we put together a compelling program to try something new? Are we ready to try something new? And I think people are.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you so much, Alex. That was really inspiring and hopeful, I feel like, conversation about some paths for the future, for a better future. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing these programs. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. And thank you everybody for listening.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. And I just want to close to remind people that next week is our last program of the year, Friday, December 10th. And we're having Mallory McDuff, who is the author of a book called Our Last Best Act, which is about environmental burial practices. Really fascinating book that looks at kind of how toxic the traditional burial industry is. And she's a professor of environmental education at Warren Wilson. So she'll be joining us from Asheville. And I hope everybody can join, and that'll be our last program before January. So thanks everyone for listening again. And thank you, Alex, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.